In the Roman night, when all roads led to imperial power, there was a woman who turned lust into a weapon. Her name was Messalina, and her end was the most shameful death in the history of royalty. Rome at night resembles a giant body, groaning under the weight of wine, lust, and intrigue. In the alleys of Subura, people tell each other an unbelievable story. Queen Messalina disguised himself, entered a brothel, and competed with prostitutes in a sick game. The story spread like wildfire and lived on like a nightmare. But let's pause for a moment. Could the queen, surrounded by guards and servants, really sneak out of the palace, just to satisfy her own pleasure? Or was this just staged image by Roman writers who regarded powerful women as monsters to be demonized? Juvenal wrote of her with satire. Tacitus and Suetonius added moralizing. As a result, Messalina emerges not as a human being, but as a symbol of decadence. We don't need to look at that scene as an exact chronicle. Instead, think of it as a mirror of obsession of Rome. The fear that women, if they stepped outside the bounds, would topple the empire. Here, the rumor was more than just a bedroom affair. It was a political tool, a hidden knife cut into Claudius's reputation by defaming his wife. In the Palatine Palace, Claudius raised his glass by candlelight, unconcerned with the aristocratic feast. Outside, Rome was weaving a whisper of indictment. And Messalina, real or not, had become the heart of the story, where lust, power, and propaganda meet. The question is no longer, what did Messalina do, but why would anyone want to believe she did that? That question is the key to understanding the tragedy that will engulf her. Cliffhanger. And when Gaius Silius, the most beautiful of the knights, appears, the rumor will no longer be a whisper. It will turn into a public scream. And Messalina would bet her throne on it. Rome built its empire not only by swords, but also by marriage. And at that crossroads, Messalina entered history, a young woman of noble birth, married to a man who seemed never destined to be emperor. Claudius Caligula's uncle, who was once considered idiot, stammering, harmless, was suddenly pushed to the throne after Caligula was assassinated in 41. It was a surprising political move. The throne was not meant for him, but his naivete made him a safe choice, easy to control, less dangerous to any faction. And Messalina, she was only 15 or 16 when she married Claudius, who was 30 years her senior. Why did the marriage happen? Was it for love, or just a link in the power game? Look at the context. Messalina belongs to Julio Claudian family, with connections to many branches of power within the court. She was not an outsider, but a suitable pawn to legitimize Claudius. An unexpected, illegitimate emperor needed a young, noble empress who could bear children to ensure the succession. Messalina provided all of that. Here we begin to see the logic of the story. Claudius needs legitimacy. Messalina is it. Flesh and blood legal certificate. And she took on the role quickly. Within a few years, Messalina bore him 2 children, Octavia and Britannicus. With that, she was not just his wife, but his mother of future royalty. But was the marriage really so asymmetrical that Claudius was merely a blind old man and Messalina a devious girl? Ancient Roman sources often downplay Claudius to highlight his wife's manipulations. Yet if Claudius was truly so incompetent, how could he have ruled for 13 years, expanded the empire into Britannia, and maintained political discipline? Perhaps he was not stupid, but simply chose to play dumb when necessary, to minimize enemies. So what became of Messalina in this situation? A young woman bound to a political marriage? Or AWHO quickly realized that he held a unique power through Claudius? Remember, in the Roman court structure, the queen has no official title. She holds no seal, she gives no law. But she has something else, access to the emperor's body. A whisper on the pillow could change a decree. A word in Claudius' ear could decide the fate of a senator. And so Messalina, from being a teenage bride, quickly became the most dangerous power broker in the Palatine. Roman sources call her the lustful queen. But one has to wonder, was she lustful, or just how male historians described any woman who dared to step out of her husband's shadow? When Tacitus tells the story, he is not concerned with distinguishing between sex and politics. he saw the two as one. For him, Messalina's lust was a symbol of Rome's decline. But perhaps, instead of reading it literally, we should read it as a metaphor of power. During the early years of her marriage, Messalina began to flex her powerful muscles, intervening in court cases, helping to arrange marriages for noble families, and eliminating political opponents with defamatory accusations. She was boss lover in the bedroom, just A.S. hallway advisor, and it was at that crossroads that Messalina's reputation began to change color. From a young bride looked at with admiration, she became a shadow that made the senator bow his head, and Rome began to ask, who really ruled, Claudius or Messalina? Cliffhanger, the question becomes more haunting when a man named Gaius Silius entered the stage. Handsome, powerful, ambitious, and soon to be at the center of the most infamous betrayal in Roman history. During her early years as Palatine, Messalina appeared to be just another young woman smiling beside the emperor. But Rome quickly realized, behind that smile was a web of power woven throughout the court. Messalina had no seat in the Senate and issued no decrees, but she possessed a power few had, approach to Claudius' body. And for an emperor who was insecure and hesitant about big decisions, the queen's whispers were as valuable as decrees. From her bedroom, Messalina began to shape Roman politics. Ancient sources say she often arranged marriage for the nobility, a seemingly small matter but with terrible weight. A marriage could unite two families or destroy a political alliance. Those who supported her were supported. Those who opposed her faced accusations, sometimes death. Tacitus tells that she caused many noble women to commit suicide, simply because they dared to resist her influence. Some details may have been exaggerated, but we cannot deny. Messalina used her position as queen to turn fear into currency. So the question is, was Messalina just a prostitute as the historians describe her, or was she a tough political player know how to use every tool at their disposal, including lust, to consolidate power? When read closely, we see that sexual accusations are often accompanied by political purge. Did Roman authors deliberately conflate the two to turn her into a symbol of decadence rather than acknowledge her as a truly formidable opponent? Some modern researchers even argue that Messalina's debauchery was largely political metaphor. Because in Rome, lewd woman was not just about sex, but a way to criticize any woman who crossed social barriers and took over power that was only reserved for men. And here we see Messalina's dangerous game. She not only manipulated the harem, but also extended her influence to justice and economics. Trials, land projects, even decisions about who had access to Claudius, all were under her control. The Romans whispered that a whole city is kneeling at the feet of the queen. The story becomes even darker when we put it in context. Claudius, an emperor who needed to be shaped by those around him, and Messalina, a young but ambitious woman, quickly filled the void. But power is never static. Once she has climbed so high, she must also maintain her balance with increasingly dangerous tricks. Cliffhanger. And then, on that stage, appeared a man, Gaius Silius. Not only handsome, not only powerful, but also daring to do the unthinkable, openly steal the Empress from the emperor. For him, Messalina would not just be a behind-the-scenes manipulator, but queen of a coup in the night. Rome is a city of rumors. No red-tiled roof is free from whispers. No cobbled street is silent for too long. And amid the whispers, the name Messalina gradually turned into a symbol, bottomless desire. Ancient historians recounted scenes that were chilling. Juvenal quipped that Messalina would sneak out of the palace, disguise herself, and compete with courtesans to see who could serve the most customers. Tacitus and Suetonius portrayed her as an insatiable woman who threw herself into a series of lovers, from nobles to slaves. But here we must pause and consider how much is true and how much is fiction. Political pen. Ask yourself, could a young queen, protected by the palace, really escape so many times to play such a crazy game? Logistical logic suggests that this would be almost impossible. But Rome did not care about the possibility. Rome needed image, and the image of the queen turning the palace into a brothel is the strongest indictment to humiliate both her and the emperor. So the rumor about Messalina's lust wasn't just about her. It was Rome's mirror of fear. A woman in power is worrisome enough. A woman who is sexually promiscuous is a sign of the empire's decadence. Lust, here, is a metaphor for power beyond the male-dominated framework. Yet we cannot completely dismiss it. Messalina clearly had affairs. What alarmed Rome was not the affair, but the way she turned it into a political tool. Her lovers were often powerful people, and that relationship entailed alliances and factions. Lust, therefore, was not just instinctual, it was strategic. In Rome, where a whisper could be a death sentence, Messalina understood the power of secrecy. Whoever slept with her, she held their secret. Whoever opposed her, she could destroy with an accusation. That is why gossip was both the weapon she uses, just as the knife that the opponent sharpened back to kill her. And the rumors got out of hand. Messalina was described as the woman who slept with Rome, an exaggeration that worked. It made her a symbol of greed and decadence. Rome liked to believe it, because it could explain every injustice, every crisis, by blaming it on one person. Cliffhanger. But among all the rumors, only one name is truly dangerous: Gaius Silius. This was no longer a secret affair. This was an alliance. And when Messalina decided to go public with her relationship with him, Rome would not just whisper, Rome would scream. In the maze of power of Rome, the name Gaius Silius appeared like a shining double-edged sword. Young, beautiful, a prestigious knight, Silius was more than just a lover. He was the one who saw in Messalina not the licentious queen that Rome rumored, but the door to the throne. Historical sources say Messalina and Silius began their relationship while Claudius was busy expanding his empire. At first, it was probably just an affair, like many other stories about her. But then it turned into a political alliance. Why? Because they both understood that Claudius, with his age and health, could not rule forever. If Claudius fell, who would succeed him? Britannicus was too young. Octavia was just a girl. And in that power vacuum, Silius could become emperor, with Messalina as his de facto empress. But Rome remembers more than this love affair. Rome remembers a horrifying ritual. Messalina and Silius were publicly married, while Claudius was still alive. A wedding, in broad daylight, with witnesses, ceremony, and even a procession. A shocking shock. One must ask, did a literal wedding really take place, or is this just an exaggeration by historians who want to portray Messalina as insane? Many modern researchers doubt this detail. But regardless of the truth, the rumor has become political death sentence. In the eyes of Rome, there was no doubt. Messalina had openly betrayed Claudius, turned her marriage into a farce, and turned the throne into a sexual trophy. Imagine the power of this image in the Roman mind. An empress leaving her husband, marrying her lover, challenging the entire social order. It was no longer a private matter, it was at a coup. The point is, if the wedding did take place, Messalina and Silius were not crazy. They may have calculated that Claudius was weak and vulnerable, that a public wedding would force him to accept a new reality. This was not just a reckless affair, but perhaps a strategic move to prepare for the overthrow of the emperor. But here, politics and desire are so intertwined that they are indistinguishable. Rome sees a, quote, promiscuous woman. But beneath that guise, Messalina may be playing the highest card of her life, the card of making herself into the real queen, not just the emperor's wife. And Rome, a city of violence and gossip, had always known how to crush those who dared to challenge order. The marriage to Silius, real or not, was enough to transform Messalina from the whisperer behind the throne wall public traitor. Cliffhanger Claudius, slow and hesitant by nature, was suddenly faced with a cruel choice: forgive his wife and accept the humiliation, or strike and make her a warning to all of Rome, and this time he would not hesitate. For years, Claudius was seen as a weak, easily manipulated emperor. Messalina used this to her advantage, turning him into a gentle shadow of her power. But after his scandalous marriage to Gaius Silius, everything has changed. Claudius, the once blind husband, is forced to face the truth. If he does not act, Rome will regard him as a traitor, a powerless king in his own palace. News of the wedding reached Claudius not through folk rumors, but from trusted courtiers, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. These were the men who controlled the administrative machinery around the emperor. They understood that Claudius' reputation was on the line. And more importantly, they understood that if Messalina and Silius succeeded, they would be the first to be purged. We need to analyze here. Claudius is not naive, but he has one fatal weakness: hesitation. In many decisions, he was guided by his courtiers. This time, that hesitation became a gap for those around him to step in, turning Messalina's love story into a national treason. The historian Tacitus relates that when Claudius heard the news, he initially did not believe it. He asked again and again, suspecting that it was a plot to slander. But his courtiers produced evidence, witnesses, and finally undeniable political logic. If you don't handle it, you will lose the throne. What is frightening here is the shift in language. At first it was just adultery. Then it became illegal marriage. And under Narcissus's hand, it turned into, quote, an attempted coup. Once the language changed, Claudius had no choice but to punish. Let's stop and look at the bigger picture. Claudius's power, which he thought belonged to him, now rests in the hands of those who know how to define things. Narcissus was not just a secretary, but-story rewriter who forced the emperor to follow her script. Messalina may have used whispers to manipulate Claudius, but now it was her courtiers who used the same tactic to bring her down. Claudius, faced with a cruel choice, ultimately acts not as a husband, but as the emperor was cornered. He ordered, "Messalina must be arrested," and from that moment, the tragedy could not be reversed. In Roman history, the most brutal decisions often came not from courage, but from fear of losing power. Claudius, who had been despised all his life, this time chose the only way to keep his throne: to destroy the woman he once trusted. Cliffhanger: as the soldiers were sent away, Messalina still believed that Claudius would forgive her, that if she only met him, she could turn things around, as she had so many times before. But the Palatine doors were closed, and this time her whispers would not save her. When the arrest warrant was issued, Messalina seemed to doubt it. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to Claudius listening, forgiving, or at least hesitating long enough for her to turn things around. This time, she still believed that if she could just see her husband, just once more, with her tears, her pretty eyes, and her pleading words, everything would be cleared up. But she was wrong. Claudius was no longer the husband in the bedroom. He had been transformed into emperor in crisis. And between the emperor and the empress, there was only room for one to survive. Messalina was taken to the garden outside the city, which had been her favorite place to rest. Ironically, it was there that she would end her life. Tacitus tells us that, at her last moment, she was handed a knife and told to kill herself. But contrary to the image of a scheming woman, Messalina, when faced with death, appeared weak, trembling. She tried but could not do it herself. In the end, a guard finished it off for her. Here we need to analyze. Why garden? The choice of setting is not random. The garden is private space. There was no crowd, no formal ceremony. It turned Messalina's death into Adelite, silently. There was no public trial, no official record, just a purge. Rome wanted her to disappear as a shadow, no chance to make a final splash. This reflected the nature of Roman power, ruthless but calculating. A public execution might have turned Messalina into a symbol of resistance. A quiet death in the garden would have reduced her to a whispered warning in the palace corridors. Another example of how Rome ruled not by the sword but by the selective memory. If we believe Tacitus, in her final moments Messalina was in a panic, crying, begging for her life. But we must also remember Tacitus wrote as a moral lesson, and his depiction of a harlot who died a cowardly death fits his moral message. Was she really like that? Or was this just the picture was painted to complete the image of a degenerate? We will never know. What is certain is that Messalina died in her early 20s, a swift end to a life of budding power. Her death was not only a personal punishment, but also a political drama. For Claudius to regain some prestige, for his courtiers to consolidate their positions, and for Rome to have a moral example of female depravity. Cliffhanger, but the story doesn't end in the garden. After Messalina's death, something even more terrifying remains: heritage. Her name would become a symbol of debauchery for 2,000 years, retold, distorted, and used as a political and cultural tool. And by the end, we will decipher: who was Messalina really? Harlot, victim, or mirror of Rome's fears? Messalina was dead. A quiet garden outside Rome held a last sob, then fell silent. But in history, death is sometimes only the beginning of another life, the life of legendary. Immediately after her execution, Claudius remained largely silent. He held no elaborate funeral, built no temple, or erected no memorial statue. Messalina was erased as if she had never existed. This was how Roman power dealt with unpleasant figures, erased from public memory. But, paradoxically, that silence made her story resonate longer. Historians, male writers, and a politically biased context have portrayed Messalina not as a complex person, but a symbol of debauchery and betrayal. Juvenal, in his satirical verses, made her a woman who fought with prostitutes. Tacitus and Suetonius painted her as the embodiment of Rome's decline. From then on, the name Messalina transcended the real person, becoming a cultural model. Any woman who dares to challenge the male-dominated order can be labeled Messalina. We must ask, who is Messalina really? A lustful young woman, an ambitious politician, or just a victim of political propaganda? When we analyze the logic of power, we see that she was not simply a sexual woman. She had a strategy, a faction, and a goal: to maintain a position for herself and her children in a court full of wolves. But because she was a woman, all the tools she used, love, marriage, networking, were translated into the language that men of the time were most likely to denigrate insatiable desire. And that legacy lasted for centuries. In Western culture, Messalina became synonymous with whore. She appeared in plays, paintings, and novels, always portrayed as hysterical, treacherous, and deserving of death. The Romans won. They had written an image that could not be erased. But if we read carefully, we see beneath the smears a woman who was truly dangerous, not because of her sex, but because she knew how to use power in ways that men could not accept. Perhaps Messalina was not the whore of the empire that Rome called her. She was victim of Rome's fear of powerful women. That fear turned her into a shameful legend, to be repeated by future generations as a deterrent lesson. But that's what makes her so enduring. Every time we mention Messalina, we're not talking about an individual, but about how society uses sex and morality to control historical memory. And when we peel away the propaganda dust, we find a much more familiar story. The story of a woman who dared to play politics in a world that never let women win. Conclude: Messalina, though she died young, is still present in every book, every curse, every painting. She is no longer the woman in the garden. She has become a mirror, showing Rome, and us today, a cold truth. History records not only actions, but also the fears and smears of those who hold the pen.